My name is Joel White. I'm the president of Horizon Government Affairs, and as was mentioned, I run a couple of coalitions. But I am just so proud today to kind of look out and see this group, because I remember the first time this group got together, there was a lot fewer people in this room. And it's a testament to your willingness to come here to DC to be a part of a movement of passionate advocates who want to make a difference. And I'm humbled to be a part of that. And so I just thank you for inviting us back year after year. I'm also honored and humbled to work with Jen Bernstein and Julia and all the folks at over at CACUS. I think that they do a fantastic job, and like I said, it's cool to be a part of this. So enough of my waxing poetically. We're here. They asked me to talk about regulatory advocacy. Aren't you excited? I was like, oh no. But it's actually really important. And the reason it's really important is because what Cheryl talked about and what Katie talked about is kind of the front end of the process. Not even the front end, the middle end of the process, where we're getting things signed into law or passed out of Congress and signed into law. What happens after that is then up to the agencies to implement the law according to their interpretation. And I can tell you that over the past two administrations, at least, there's been some liberal liberties taken with the interpretations of some of the laws as written by Congress. And so the agencies actually have a lot of power when implementing a regulation. So regulatory advocacy is becoming increasingly important, and it's also very, very difficult. So first and foremost, a law gets signed. Then you have usually draft regulations, and these usually come out a while after the law was signed. It's usually published in the federal or state register, so you can actually read the stuff. It's usually kind of doesn't even sound like it's been written in English, but by some bureaucrat deep in an office building somewhere in the bowels of the federal government. These are usually proposed rules, which means they accept public comment. They take those into consideration, and then they put a final rule out at the end of the process. This is really important. What I like to tell people is every time there's a chance to comment, comment. Even if it takes you 15 minutes to pull a letter together and say, hey, I'm really concerned about this issue, there's a reason for this. One, the agency may actually take your views into consideration and change that regulation and change the policy, okay? The second thing is it creates an opening or an opportunity for you to follow up with that agency to say, I submitted a comment letter on this. I want to meet with you to talk about what I'm concerned about. So always, 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 always take the opportunity to comment on draft regulations. These draft regulations and comments then get tabulated and tallied, and any draft rules have to be reviewed generally by the lawyers and by OIRA over at OMB. You don't need to know about that, just that there's a regulatory office at the White House that reviews all of these things. Sometimes there's public hearings, particularly when the FDA is concerned, which is really important because it creates another avenue or venue to weigh in. And then, like I said, the agency either takes those comments into account or not, issues a final rule or not, and then once the final rule is issued, that policy actually is put into place. And so what is regulatory advocacy? If that's the process, what is regulatory advocacy? It's basically the same as congressional advocacy, but it's different. It's the same in the sense that it's the stuff that we know how to do really well, right? We tell our stories. We talk about our personal experiences. We do it over the phone. We do it in emails. We write letters. We have meetings. Some of us do demonstrations. Some of us do marches or sit-ins. We use social media to align our campaigns, right? We get people involved. We're really good at that. But a lot of times we leave it on the congressional side and we don't use it on the regulatory side. And that's a mistake, I think, because, again, those policies are getting implemented and effectuated at the regulatory level. Typically, every regulatory advocacy campaign has two components. It's either got a grassroots component or it's got an inside ballgame component. It's either one or the other. Very few are both. There we go, sorry. You guys probably can't even read that, can you? Well, you can. You got better eyesight than I do. Anyway, so how to be effective. Like I said, you already know how to be effective. You tell your story. Keep it personal, but keep it respectful. Stay informed, gather intelligence and information. There's a wonderful new website called regulations.gov, and that will actually post all of the information about a particular regulation on the website and tell you what you can do with it. You can submit comments, you can review, you can analyze, you can come to a public hearing, you can submit your comments for a public hearing, things like that. And it's a great way to link to that website to the information about the regulation that you care about. Know the key decision makers. So before I get to my case studies, how many people care about the fact that if you go out of network under the Affordable Care Act, your expenses don't count against your annual out-of-pocket limit? Raise your hand if you care about that. In other words, if I saw an out-of-network doctor, everything I spend on that out-of-network doctor doesn't count towards my annual limit. Is that an important issue? Do you know who has jurisdiction in determining that policy outside of the law? CMS, CSIO. How many people know what CSIO is? CSIO makes this decision every year, or they could have it. They could change the policy every year. That is an agency within CMS that issues a regulation called the Notice of Benefit and Payment Parameters every year that talks about the out-of-network issue and the out-of-pocket and sets the out-of-pocket limit and so forth. How many people know what the NAIC is? It's the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. How many people know Brian Webb? Brian Webb is the guy at the NAIC who was looking at the out-of-network issue in terms of applying the annual payment limit, that was providing advice to the people at CSIO through CMS that were determining the regulation this year and how to handle this issue. RDLA, I came to RDLA and said, this is important, guys, let's weigh in. So we actually submitted a bunch of comment letters to the NAIC for their consideration. I talked to Brian Webb about this. And guess what? It had an impact. Now, they didn't change the policy this year, but we'll be back next year, right? And next year. And why? Because it's important. Now we've got a track record. We're weighing in with the agencies that matter, that people care about, and that are determining the policy. And that's why it's really important to be very clear on your message and what you're advocating for. Just like congressional advocacy, regulatory advocacy is the same way, only different. It is different in the sense that for members of Congress, they're running for re-election, okay? So they almost have to be more responsive. If you get a bureaucrat who's been in an agency for 20 years, what does he care what you have to say? He cares because most people want to make a difference in this world. And so, at least that's my line, I'm sticking to it. So there's two case studies. We can get into detail, but basically it embodies the grassroots one or the inside ballgame one. In the grassroots run, there's a Part D rule that came out last year, created a firestorm of opposition. There were op-eds and there were blogs and there were congressional hearings and there was a media component and there were people being outraged all over the place, and basically that rule got withdrawn. That was an example of regulatory advocacy, and we were involved in that. The other rule is the inside ballgame. How many people have heard of the CMS AMP rule? Well, there's so maybe one person here. There's a policy in the CMS AMP rule that is whether to do line extension rebates for rare and orphan products. And if those rebates were applied to those products, it would probably be a death knell for a lot of manufacturers. They just wouldn't sell the product because it wouldn't make any sense. There's a guy at CMS, John Koster, who's in the Medicaid division and the pharmacy division, who's determining that policy. And there's a bunch of people who have gone in and talked to John Koster in a very quiet way and a very respectful way about what that policy would mean to patients around the country. So those are two examples. There's an opportunity coming up called PDUFA. You say, PDUFA, when does that get reauthorized? In 2017. Why should I care about it now? I'm glad you asked. This is why. See every box on this chart? You can't see the words in there, but every box on that chart represents an opportunity to weigh in on the regulatory process between now in 2017 when that bill gets sent to Congress. And so that's our opportunity to affect change at FDA, to make them more transparent, to make them more responsive to patients, to work on the surrogate endpoint issue, to do lots of stuff, okay? So my point is there's lots of opportunities over the next 2 years to conduct regulatory advocacy that will have a tremendous impact on the people that you care about. So, thank you very much. I'm getting the hook. Not because I think regulatory advocacy is boring, but because I've said too much already. But again, I am so proud and I'm so humbled to be a part of this organization. You all deserve a lot of credit for making this a passionate movement of dedicated advocates, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joel.